Welcome to All About Art. My name is Alexandra, and I'm an art historian, curator, and writer. Within this podcast, topics relating to art history, cultural policy, the art sector, as well as a large range of other art-related topics will be covered. Conducting critical discussions, having entertaining exchanges, or just enjoying some relaxing chats, All About Art is where you'll find it all. Join me in exploring and developing cultural discourse. Welcome to another episode of All About Art. This one very much focuses on a career in the arts that is really hands-on and is intrinsic to the transportation and display of works of art. The topic is all about art framing with established framer and my wonderful friend, Gregory Baker. Within this episode, we chat about his business as an art framer and how he learned his craft. We also chat about materials he uses, such as the various types of glass and how they affect a work of art, as well as his experience as an art technician at Sotheby's auction house, which informs his practice today. Greg graduated from Central St Martin's with a degree in fine art and went on to work for Steward Heslop frames and John Davies frames in the years following his degree. He then proceeded to work for Sotheby's auction house and Alon Zakim Fine Art while starting his own business. He collaborated with Sotheby's and has framed works by the likes of Cy Twombly, Lucien Freud, David Hockney, Georg Baselitz, and Jenny Saville. He is currently working with artist and art dealer David Breuer-Weil, whose sculptures you probably know from St Pancras New Church at Euston here in London, all while maintaining his framing studio and furthering his practice. Thank you, Greg, for coming on All About Art and telling us about your career, your craft, and more. And now, on to the interview. Greg, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. I am just going to start with the very first question. Tell me about your education and your early career. What led you to opening up your own business in framing?
Well, early career. I suppose this begins... Oh, let's start at university. As with most arts graduates, you're sort of like kicked out into the real world with some sense of, I don't know how you describe it, sort of bemusement, confusion, or whatever. Luckily though, and this is all credit to my friend Matt Lippiat, he was in contact with somebody that wanted to buy a reproduction of a photograph that he'd made at university. We were together on the same course at St Martin's studying fine art. And he had a friend who owned a framing workshop, or framers, in Battersea, and Matt went there, and he was looking around at all the different tools and practices that are required, and the person who owned the shop, Stuart Heslop, was asking whether he knew anyone who might be looking for a job, and I certainly was at the time. So thankfully, by extension to Matt, I got the first opportunity to experience anything to do with picture framing. And I was there for about a year and a half, and I think I've described it before, it's the closest thing I possibly could have had to an apprenticeship. I went from a position of not knowing a blessed thing about framing, or at least bespoke picture frame making, to being able to then go and actually put the things together. Any art student probably has some contact with putting things in frame for the sake of presenting their work, and that certainly was the case for me. I bought a number of pre-made frames from, I think it was a shop called The Pier, for the photographs that I'd made for my BA degree show. But that seems like a long memory, a long time ago. And I remember, finding it difficult trying to, the mystery behind cutting a mount in a decently thick piece of mount board seems completely unapproachable. And
yeah, for those who don't know, what even is a mount board?
Oh, a mount board is, as there are with a lot of aspects of framing, one of the many uses of ideally a conservation board, normally derived, if we're looking at the conservation and the framing, derived from a acid neutral source, whereas opposed a lot of paper is derived from wood, which is heavily invested in acidic content. A conservation board is derived from cotton rag, which is a lot more pH neutral. This becomes important when handling artworks which are sensitive to these imbalances in alkali or acid.
So it's basically a layer between the actual artwork and the wood of the frame, so between, let's say, paper or canvas and maybe something else. So mount board is kind of something in between?
Yes, so it's there to, its primary function is to act as a barrier between a given artwork and that which might be a possible threat. And there are many threats, or there are many things that might stand in the way to unnaturally age an artwork or damage it in some ways. Conservation framing is a battle in trying to preserve whatever you possibly can for as long as possible. Although it's, and I like to think of this in many ways, there's no business a frame has in really being together. There are so many disparate materials.
Yeah.
And with all things that are constructed, their aim is to really get back to Earth. And they will do this through gravity or accident. Things will smash. and so the picture frame exists really as this peculiar aberration of materials, which, for the most part, can act to protect a picture. Of course it can.
So that's one of many functions of the frame.
Yeah.
What was it that led you? So you started out in working at a framer's, and
Yes.
what led you to then open up your own business? And when did you do it? What was the timeline there?
Well, there's about 15 years between those 2 points. So I left the framers sometime around 2008. I think it was. I then worked for an oil paint maker, Michael Harding Artist Oil Colours. So keeping it close to the art materials, of course. Then there were a number of years in between which weren't necessarily related to the art world, and this was a source of great or disquiet or dissatisfaction. And I would say the route back towards framing came from taking the job as a art handling technician at Sotheby's.
Which is where you and I met.
This is right. This is right. But this is a few years later than that. But the thing that crystallized it, and as I describe my experience at Stewart's as something of an apprenticeship, I thought it would be an interesting experiment to see, okay, how much can I remember? And if given the opportunity of using a space and having the right tools, is it possible to rake over what I might have remembered and produce a picture frame? What really kicked it off was Sotheby sent us on a training day of sorts to framers in West Brompton, Derek Tannis, whose family have been framing for several generations. And if anything, it was an olfactory overload of things that were at one point familiar. So the smell of, and it really was the smell and the sense of the gelatin or the Vaseline, or more than anything, probably the beeswax or wax that's involved in finishing frames, or the other aspects that are involved in gilding frames, which I'm not a skilled gilder at all, but so many different, methylated spirits and other noxious chemicals, which they're of course, in great quantities, not good news. But in the same way, they do, smell does stir the memory.
Yeah,
it really does.
Of course. Why do you think that the frame is so important when it comes to art?
Well, the primary concern is how are you going to show it? Mm-hmm. One can think of the first works of art that we ever encounter in our lives, and these might be posters of our favourite films, or cutouts from magazines, or obviously this is drawing on my history of all things pre-screen and publication before digital dissemination and all of that is brought along. But pictures have always been popular. They will continue to be popular, and there will be a desire to see them in the home. So you can start from very basics. Okay, how are we going to get this picture on the wall? Well, maybe blue tack might be a solution. Well, maybe you want something a little more permanent than that. So, okay, maybe some form of framing device. So on the one hand, it's the practical concern of the frame is to protect the work of art, and also maybe even to protect the environment that it's in. That's one thing. The next part, I suppose, the other aspect is, having dealt with how do you do it, why do you want to? What is it you're trying to preserve? Is it a picture that means an awful lot to you? And in this way, you can see that there's a similarity between what a frame does and what a photo album does. Which, by the way, the family photo album will be the greatest work of art that you ever create or ever contribute to. And it's the one thing, when people talk about pictures, it is the one thing that you will rescue from a fire, if you know where it is. And I think there is this fundamental connection to images. And this is something which I think has persisted for a long time. Now it's a little more difficult because our relationship to cloud computing and the way in which we store digital photographs. But unless everything is brought onto a sort of digital platform, some things remain physical always.
Yes.
And once they are destroyed, they are gone forever. That's not to say that, you know, a photograph is the memory of a particular time in one's family, but they are remarkable aids to times and experiences. But anyway, so having decided what it is you want to frame, you are then in the luxurious moment of deciding, okay, well, what is it going to look like? So this is referring to Douglas Adams, the 3 stages of any civilization: the how, why, and sophistication stages. In his example, it's how do we eat, why do we eat? And the third question is, where do we go for lunch? So the part for the frame is, okay, we've got the ability. What fancy manner are we going to decorate it with? And this is where one has to consider the convention of framing or putting something around a picture. I'm not well versed enough to give you a history lesson in quite the legacy of adorning pictures and even the convention of exhibiting pictures for a public or for personal pleasure. But style is a key question. You can trace particular styles in culture through the manner in which they have framed. Much so that, you can have a novel which is the anti-novel. You can have a frame which is the anti-frame or not framing anything. Yeah. It becomes in itself a framing convention.
Yes. I think like within art historical discourse and generally within curating as well, we have these discussions a lot. But also thinking about framing within framing. I remember when I was an art history student and I was in class and we were talking about Jacques Derrida. And Jacques Derrida has this whole theory on framing and an artwork within an artwork, a frame within a frame within a frame, that the wall frames the frame and the frame frames the artwork. Yeah. And I just remember sitting there being like, what? But at the same time, I think that it's really interesting to discuss. Because when it comes to the early modern Dutch paintings, for example, Victor Stoykita, an art historian, he theorized about niches and about framing, either framing the figures or framing different artworks within an artwork or something like that. It was always incredibly interesting to think about it from an art historical context, but then also now, at least from my professional standpoint, thinking about how it affects the viewer, or let's say the buyer, if someone wants to collect it for their home, how it affects the space. Because I do feel like framing is so incredibly important. It is a form of contextualization of the artwork, which is what curating involves all the time.
Oh, absolutely. It is a convention. It functions perfectly well. My memories of studying fine art brought everything into question. Every aspect of something you produce, its presentation is intentional. So the choice of frame is intentional. The particular type of frame is an intention. And this was always a point of struggle in a way. I might suggest I'm more of a formalist or traditionalist, much in the same way that the received manner by which one might appreciate a sculpture is on a plinth. The frame does the same for a picture, two-dimensional picture. Well, I suppose this is one of the single tenets of what a frame should do. It should be there to not only protect the artwork, but also enhance it. But not to enhance it so much that it becomes the focus. In fact, many comparisons might be made to the way in which music is written for a film, to score it. One doesn't notice it if it's effective. It has a direct emotional effect.
Yeah.
Poor choice of words. On the viewer, its content is communicated implicitly. But one recognizes when you're listening to a great score in a film much in the same way that a good frame will enhance an artwork. Absolutely. A bad frame will bring it down, and the bad ones are easy to spot.
That's true. They're easy to spot because they take away from the artwork, or they over-dominate, or something like that.
Yes, and certainly this can be seen in say, the history. It's certainly things that were fashionable, say, in the court of Louis XIV, have not persisted. Though I would say that the manner in which a lot of Impressionist works of art, and you see this a lot at Sotheby's and Christie's and all auction houses, just the quantity of pictures that are framed in such a manner, carved and gilded and swept with shells in the corners and everything, certainly was the order of the day. But then the Sun King was not known for his modesty. But this again, it's the ostentation of a previous year becomes the convention of the next.
Yes.
And even now, I still think that Dutch frames or Dutch cabinetry style frames, they knew how good they were back then, and they're still magnificent now. Superb, Technicolor, black, shining, ebonized frames, just absolutely wonderful. But they do set the tone. And if what you're looking at is a painting from the Dutch Golden Age, this is fitting. This is certainly something that I learned from a job which I had in between working at the Framers and working for Sotheby's. This was another Framers called John Davis Framing. And John Davis was based in St James's, and their speciality was antique reproduction frames. So you would be able to pick a period accurate frame to the age of the picture. Mm-hmm. And of course in St James's there are a lot of old master pitch dealers around there, so it is choosing something which is perfectly in line with the historic background of any work of art, and it looks correct. These works on panel or canvas have survived hundreds of years, and it would just be a disservice and a vast anachronism to sort of stick them in a spray white painted tray frame which would befit a Gerhard Richter Abstraktes build or anything like that. It just wouldn't do. It can be done. It is done, but somehow the convention and tradition, sticking to something which might be seen as an obvious choice, actually allows you to view the work.
Yes, and this is what we were talking about with the soundtrack of a film, for example. It shouldn't take away or take over. There was one interesting frame that I saw recently, and it was in the Contemporary Art Day auction sale at Sotheby's, and it was by the Haas brothers. And it was so interesting because the artist's frame was in bronze, and it had this very odd shape. It was very squiggly, and it had these little extremities coming from it. It looked almost like frozen goo just coming out of the painting. But the painting was also completely odd in its subject matter and in its sort of very, what's the word, slightly extraterrestrial. Well, not extraterrestrial.
Well, these reminded me of the works that Dali had done, the shaped canvases.
Yes.
So the outline of I don't know whether it be Dali and Gala, but two figures, shoulders upwards, and the canvas is shaped like heads and shoulders, and the frame follows suit. But Dali is, his interest in the malformation of rigid forms under the prism of his, what's he called? The paranoid critical technique he employs. Any rigid object becomes plastic in Dali's imagination. But interesting to destroy or to play about with the convention of a rectangle. There's no reason that a frame needs to be a hard rectangle. There's no reason a painting needs to be rectangular.
Right, but if the painting is rectangular, do you think the frame should be?
It depends on the work. One of the things I was thinking about this, the genesis, say, of any work that's going to be framed, any frame, it always flows from the artwork, and it has to. This is the realm of custom manufacture. This is bespoke making. The obvious analogy is to consider somebody who's being fitted for a dress or a suit. Of course, there are a billion options out there for you to buy something off the shelf, but It's not unique. And sometimes the requirements of the frame need to be tailored. The use of the word tailor is completely accurate. They need to be geared around the picture.
Yeah.
And in the case of this one here that you're showing me, it is an extension of the artwork.
It is.
There are so many works by Matthew Barney derived from his Craymaster series. The frame is some form of polyurethane plastic, which looks a bit like a sort of form of Vaseline features heavily in all those films, but it's totally fitting. It is a uniform type of frame that he's used on a lot of reproductions or stills or images from those films. But this is in the realm now of artist frame, and this is a completely different concern. There's something I remember we had it was either a Reiselberg, or I don't know, one of the pointillist painters, and the painting had extended onto the frame that the artist had used on the canvas. So of course, when it comes to auction, that in itself is a part of the artwork.
Yeah. Doesn't Howard Hodgkin also do that?
Well, Hodgkin's dialogue with framing is absolutely completely on the same level, but one would never frame a Hodgkin, but you could.
But a Hodgkin is framed.
But yes, but I suppose it depends on.
So a frame within a frame. So we're back at Derrida.
Yeah,
I never escape him.
No, what is where does the artwork end? I suppose with physical objects like a painting or a canvas or a sculpture, its physical limits are the boundaries. With a frame, which certainly canvases and photographs, but say lots of work on paper, it is a natural extension, if you like, sort of armor plating for a picture. For the things that we've covered, it has to be there practically to hold the object on the wall, but it's also there to announce it as well.
We were talking earlier about tailoring and bespoke making. Would you mind telling me a bit about the whole process of making a frame from start to finish? I know that many people are sometimes surprised at the cost of frames, but when I came to your studio and we made a frame together, the effort and the detail that goes into it really made me appreciate the craft.
Oh, well, that was great fun. The little pink frame.
Yes.
Well, from beginning to end, there are so many routes, so many styles or techniques one might employ depending on the picture. And I say this is where it all begins. If you're building something for a particular picture, it has to start there. If one is say framing a photograph and using a more traditional manner of presentation in mounting the photograph behind or within a mount board or over mount and under mounts, there are certain conventions you might want to stick to. So maybe a white mount board with a black frame, maybe that's suitable. Maybe not. Maybe this is a canvas and we want to go for a tray frame, which is an open-faced, as with all frames, box that allows you to get the canvas on the wall, protects the edges, but also acts as a fantastic border that can help define or differentiate canvas painting from the wall. And then there's everything in between. I mean, you could be framing. I mean, this is maybe the purview of high street framers, but a football shirt. You could be framing a cricket ball, anything like that. In the work that I've done, certainly concentrated on maybe more works on paper. So deciding what's required, it's hand in hand with the nature of the work. So from then on, it's if you have an idea of where it's going, if you've decided with your client, this is the manner which we want to present the work. There are a couple of things that I have done in the past, and that's you can produce a digital mock-up, which as much as any framer will have corners of samples of frames or mount boards, I think it goes just as well. And this is something I did learn from John Davis framing, that if you present something which is a virtual creative, what's the word for a recreation, but before it happens?
I guess maybe a digital draft?
Digital draft is very good. it just helps the conversation go along, or it just helps the decisions to be made quickly. So with any frame of any persuasion of any destiny, measurements are key. So the one thing with any picture frame is there is an awful lot of malleability in our decisions and choices, but at some point specific measurements have to be taken, and this is where millimeter accuracy is required. This is a tolerance to which there are many industries out there that work far smaller tolerances. I mean, my father's a precision engineer, and the tolerances of the metalwork that he has to produce are within microns. And considering that a millimetre is 1,000 microns, 2 millimetres seems like a holiday compared to the requirements of some. So you've got your measurements, you've got what it is you're going for. It's then a question of building. I mean, the frame that we had was derived from, as so many frames, lengths cut at a particular style of moulding. This is cut using a mitre guillotine or a morceau, as everyone who refers to a vacuum cleaner as a hoover. Morceau is a mitre guillotine in the same way.
What does something like that look like?
A mitre guillotine, it's 100 kilograms of steel in a way. It has two large knives which are mechanically driven by a sprung-loaded pedal.
The one that I used.
Yes,
yes.
There's only one. This is something you will see in every framers. It's a fantastic piece of kit. It does not produce dust. It's almost completely. It is completely mechanical. The important thing is knowing to use them appropriately.
Yes, I remember you hovering over me and trying to teach me how to use this. I do distinctly remember that.
Well, it'll be to my unending nightmares if anything were to happen. I think that extension of care is completely necessary, and
of course
it is part of the concentration, creating something which is precise and accurate.
Yes, and using these tools. Just to kind of describe what something like this looks like, it's basically you have the metal kind of top, and you press the lever down with your foot in order to precisely cut wood.
Yes, yeah. It's the technology of a mitre guillotine allows you to nibble away at
That's
at
a really
wood.
good way of describing it.
Well, as with all things, say cutting a mount board, one could choose to power through in one stroke using a Stanley blade. I mean, it's a sharp knife. I think it's possibly the one implement that will cause most injuries in any workshop because it's so small, and the amount of respect it really requires is maybe not met by anyone who's using it. But with cutting mount board, you take many strokes, 4 or 5, however many takes it are required to cut it into two. The same goes for cutting moulding in lengths. You take away parts, you nibble. So the last stroke of the knives on the mitre guillotine take just what you want away. Mm-hmm. I mean, it has guides and everything that you can adjust to for repeat work.
Well, and to make sure if you're not just cutting straight through, if you want to cut at if you want to cut at a certain angle, and you need to know.
Yes, this is variable as well. Yeah. It is set at the blades are set at 45 degrees, but the angle that the guard can be adjusted against it is anything from 45 to 90. I mean, this can be useful for a number of things. Cutting subframes, cutting spacers or fillets, but that's another part of it. So you've got the lengths of your frame cut. There's the method by which you might fix the mitres together. The method by which I learned, the method I use a lot, or that I learned at Stewart's, was side pinning. This is a traditional way of introducing pins across the mitre, which lends the corner strength. But there's an endless number of ways. One can use all glue and tape, and then pin it together with a with a gun, with a pin gun. You could go the extra fancy manner of cutting out notches across the mitre and splining it together. Any number of things, but I'm not wood craftsman enough to really. I know some techniques that work, and that's fine. So there's construction, then there's the long process of finishing, sanding to whatever degree of finish you require. Obviously, pinning, filling, sanding, finishing, which might include waxing or staining to whatever the specification of the frame, the tone of wood that you're going for. I mean, that's just the aspects of the frame. Then there's everything that goes in it. So if the artwork needs preparation to be housed within the frame, if it's a canvas in a tray frame, that's slightly different. But say we have a photograph, here we have the necessary use of glass, a mount board, a backboard, subframe potentially. This is easier to demonstrate in pictures maybe than to describe for anyone who can't picture these things. But the process is considerable. It is not instantaneous, and the surprise that might visit someone who has gone to a custom frame, a bespoke framer, I suppose is informed by everything we've learned from the high street. When IKEA can produce a frame that costs £6 versus something which would actually cost 20 times that, no wonder that everyone might be a little outraged at the costs involved, because as with all bespoke products, it's a combination of time and materials. But of the two, it's the time that's the most costly, always. And it is that which you are paying for. There is no reason that your frame should exist for your particular work of art, unless through the skills and abilities of a framer that's there to make it for you. Yeah, you could put it in an IKEA frame. You could put it in a Habitat frame. I mean, it might be fine.
I do like Habitat frames.
Well, the thing is, they're very good. They do fulfill their requirements.
Yes, but I love my pink bespoke frame more.
There we are. Maybe there's such a thing as one can sense the energy invested in something that's created.
Well, I mean, here
hand.
we are back at Walter Benjamin, all of this, we sense the energy in a physical work of art. We sense the energy in a physical frame.
Well, this is something which can only really come from a frame nerd like me. The best thing that anyone can do is to really ignore the thing when one's looking at the artwork. But once inducted into the manner of frame making, you will look out for these things. And then, of course, you'll become a complete pedant in pointing out everyone else's faults.
Yes, I know. I have been to exhibitions with you.
Yeah, it is only natural.
One last question about materials and tools and things like that. I would love to know a little bit more about different types of glass.
Ah, yes. Many forms. Well, the legacy of conservation framing has allowed for many types of, or a lot of technology or technological development in the way in which ultraviolet light can be filtered before it ever hits a work of art. We've all seen images of newspapers or promotional posters in shop fronts where a certain pigment of the print is absolutely wiped out. This might be reds or blues or whatever. Ultraviolet light takes no prisoners when it comes to damaging it, and it's a form of burning, but it happens over a very long time.
So if your artwork is displayed in a place near a window in your home and sunlight comes on it, this is what can damage your art. Yes,
indeed. We all know how newspaper print yellows. Newspaper, by its very nature, is not designed for time. It is not designed for the ages. This has been a subject matter for all artists, and you won't see a Braque or a Picasso collage that's not deeply sort of tan coloured. I'm sure it wasn't of course it wasn't when it was produced, but this is the colour that paper can denature toward. So the manner in which you can help to safeguard your artwork from the damaging effect of ultraviolet light is to use a specialist glass. Normal glass, which one might refer to as float glass, float because it refers to the manner by which molten glass or molten sand or whatever is distributed on a bed of molten tin, so it floats on the top. This is the type of glass that will be in most off-the-shelf frames. It is transparent, and that's basically all it is. It's transparent and brittle.
I would love to just interject and say, we were talking about IKEA frames.
Oh, yes.
Most IKEA frames have plastic.
Oh.
They don't even have glass.
No. I mean, this is another remarkable price or cost efficiency on IKEA's part. It really is just upgraded cellophane that they use for the glazing. It is utterly terrible. There are credit cards of greater substance than that stuff. Really awful. Likewise with that, it really is just a protective barrier between the artwork and the outside world. The next step up from just a transparent glazing would be something that has a coating on it. The first one you would go to, much in the same way that your sunglasses have a UV filtering coating on them. Conservation clear glass will filter 99% of ultraviolet light from the artwork. Of course, 99%, if you wanted 100%, it would be a black board. So nothing would penetrate that. But of course, we're still in the convention of actually seeing the work of art that's in a picture frame.
Does that 99% have any effect on how the picture can be viewed?
Very little. The level of transparency that specialist glazing can offer is normally incredibly good. There's something which can be referred to as greying, this is very picky territory though. But I think for the assurance, knowing that the glass in front of your work of art is going to prevent it from burning over time. And maybe this is, as an aside, this goes into our appreciation of works of art over time. Time as we understand it is essentially governed by the way in which we live our lives, the time that we are alive. So seeing a picture in a frame, it's like, well, that can be there forever. We're not alive forever. We are but finite. And our custodianship of artworks is also finite. One will pass to the next. It's the same with all these works of Impressionist art, post-Impressionist. There will be several owners, and there will be many owners after them. So the conceit that putting something in a frame will last forever is really only that. It is something which at some point will have to be changed. It can't stay there forever. Anyway, minimizing the effects of UV light, one might choose filtering, 99% filtering glass, or there are other speciality types of glass which will combine not just filtering aspects of glass, but also cutting down on reflection. This might be referred to as museum glass, which combines these two characteristics, protecting the artwork from ultraviolet light, but also not being reflective in itself, and in fact inviting the viewer a little more in to the artwork. And it's certainly one of those times you might have to double take as to whether there is even glass in front of a work of art, whatever that might be. It could be a work of textile, it could be a painting, it could be a photograph. But this is where you start getting into more costly territory. The specialist glass, of course, is a pricier material, and the price of the framing has to reflect that. It's a basic material expense. Although, of course, the most magnificent material of all is Optium clear acrylic, it has the properties of being like museum glass, UV filtering and anti-reflective, but the added bonus of not being brittle in the same way that glass is, and also pound for pound or gram for gram is a lot lighter. This might be a concern if you're framing a work of art that has to travel across great distances. Glass tape can be used an awful lot to protect at least the artwork. It's certainly not to protect the glass, because if there is an issue or if there is to shatter, at least glass tape, if used across the surface of the glazing, will keep the glass together. The filtering that's applied, which is a form of plastic shield that's applied to the glass anyway, might be able to offer some level of physical cohesion, but glass tape can be used an awful lot. This is, of course, a nightmare for the specialist coating on something like museum glass, because it will leave a huge amount of,
residue?
Marks, scuff marks. With acrylic, this might not be a concern. Though if you're using Optium acrylic, it is immensely expensive. So this then goes back to maybe the value of the artwork or the budget of the client. What is most fitting for the work of art? Maybe it might be better for the work of art not to travel in its frame, but that's another consideration. That's logistics more than anything.
Yeah. Speaking of funds and money, because I don't think that we speak about these things often enough, can you tell me a bit more about the pricing and how you've broken it down for yourself? I am asking because it not only shows what goes into each frame financially and time-wise, but it also may help a young entrepreneur who is interested in coming into the business to decide how they will set their pricing.
Well, I suppose it depends on what's being produced. The most useful piece of advice I was given by a friend a number of years ago was just to look at the very basics. What's involved in moving raw materials towards a finished product? Well, it's material cost and the time it takes to do it. So yes, trying to define a price or a cost is, I find it a challenge, even though the basics might be to draw some multiplication between the amount of time you spent on something and the material cost. How does one define the value of your time? Well, you might start by thinking, okay, what's an hourly rate? What would be a suitable hourly rate to cover the cost of the rent of your studio space, the power required to run various bits of kit, the overheads that you have, but it's one can very very quickly get bogged down into finding multiplication factors of this, that, and the other, that sometimes you have to almost feel it in a more organic way. And I think even though trying to make sure that you're in profit in producing the things you have or are going to use and then create. I mean, the convention for, say, material costs is always, 1.5 times their cost. You're buying them at a rate from the supplier, but there has to be a markup. And that markup has to represent the ability for you to make funds. Otherwise, one can spend a lot of time making stuff, but the way I think of that is, if there is no possibility for remuneration on the time you invest, if one's being critical, one could then describe one's industry or efforts as worthless or without value. What value is there if you're working for free? By very definition, there has to be a value attached to the time that you're spending on doing something, because how might one continue to do it?
Making frames is a very hands-on process. Do you feel like it has something meditative to it, or do you feel like it is something where you have to stay really highly concentrated because you're working with power tools and sharp objects?
Oh, absolutely, the meditative quality of it. And I think that is derived from the concentration. The common phrase or the common word might be to describe it as mindful. But the focusing on producing something, at least for me, has been an incredibly attractive process. And this has been an aspect of any number of projects or pictures that I've made at university and thereafter. An interest certainly in process work. And as someone attempting to practice art, completely lost if given free rein. So for me, working to a parameter or an instruction, or at least a set of rules, is a far more attractive prospect. Within those rules, I feel like I'm set free, shall we say. But I don't find it anywhere near as daunting as trying to define your own project. So I think this is certainly one of the attractions that framing has offered as a way of using my interest in cutting things accurately or whatever, working to a specification. So I find the entire process one in which you can be completely involved. The concentration or the care required to work in a safe manner, absolutely. One should always be conscious of safe working practice. But accidents are to be avoided.
But that's why we have the safety goggles and all of that.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. But as much as the equipment can be acquired to prevent incident or injury, the methodology or the attitude is as much a part of it. I mean, this goes back to a question that a number of people have asked me about in my role as a technician at Sotheby's, handling artwork. And they're asked, do you ever get nervous about handling something? I say, well, if you think about it for a while, if you're handling so many pictures over a number of years...
David Hockney's Splash.
Yes.
Rembrandt's.
This is true.
I mean, yeah.
Well, certainly with canvases, there really is a way to do it, and there are many ways not to. And after a certain amount of experience, you have to almost go out of your way to damage something. It's every aspect of procedure in art handling is there to ensure that the work is treated with as much care as possible. Yeah. And that comes from the attitude and care and methodology that's used in handling it. The same completely extends to picture framing. The care that one is required to execute is making sure that this has happened to all framers, that the measurements of the rebate of the frame are accurate.
Yes.
I've made frames that have gone from raw material to completion and they're 10 centimetres incorrect. Oversights will happen, but trying to arrive at a working practice which irons out, it will be a lifetime's work. It's certainly something to aspire to, and I almost think it is the final level of being a total master of one's craft. I'm decades away from ever being even like a professional, but it is something to
give yourself some credit, Greg.
Let's say semi-professional, but there we are.
You just mentioned Sotheby's, and so I do want to jump to my next question by saying that you have framed works for institutions such as Sotheby's. So what was that like, and how did that work?
Well, this came about as an extension maybe of my time having worked as a technician there. The familiarity with, handling very valuable works of art, an immense education of sorts, but also recognizing from within the opportunity that might exist for someone who is capable of handling pictures, not only in and out frames, but maybe creating frames. I know when I started working for Sotheby's, their warehouse in Greenford, my experience in having worked at framers was called upon quite frequently in maybe an advisory capacity, but mostly in a practical sense of how are we going to get this thing out, or how are we going to put this thing back in? And I wouldn't say that I was completely up to speed with handling either Gerhard Richter's or Damien Hirst or Patrick Caulfield's. This is obviously name dropping, but
that's fine.
But the attitude is common to all of them. If they're canvases, of course, there are many forms of art, but if one is careful and you respect a number of basic techniques, it's difficult for something to go wrong. I mean, this extends to making sure that the screws are the right length, because there are huge potential hazards that can happen where the screws go in. So it really, certainly in terms of approaching an artwork, it breeds a very, very close and a very, one could say, intimate relationship with the work of art. Maybe not in a way that many other people experience. At some point, a person has to touch this thing. It might appear that the artist's genius has willed this object into existence. And certainly the cataloguing of any auction houses might do so much to convince you of that. But they're physical objects. They need to be handled. So with my association with Sotheby's, possibly a realization that there is a skill for which framers are employed. The work is potentially outsourced. But the thing that I felt I was able to bring to the job was a familiarity with picture framing or techniques by which works can be mounted. In as much as, if I've seen these things before, it's not so much of a surprise opening it up. For someone who maybe has not been in the process of constructing a frame, it might be unfamiliar territory. And if you're handling something that's, again, being methodological in your approach will stand you in good stead for most things. But if you've seen the way in which a frame is constructed, or having some knowledge of its physical creation, you know which bits might be attached to other bits. I mean, that's putting it in very very
simple terms.
Simple terms.
Yeah,
so simple I can't think of it. But so really sort of having that, maybe being a little entrepreneurial in recognizing there's an opportunity here to offer a framing service which is specific to auction houses. The unique aspect of framing or the way in which frames are dealt with in auction houses is that one might take a work of art to a framer, it be framed, and it be on your wall for decades. In an auction house, that work's coming out of the frame. Not just once, but many times. And the frame is probably overused to the point where it will suffer. Ultimately, yes, the frame is not the work of art. It is the manner by which it's presented or transported or handled. But knowing a number of the requirements of a frame that might be used in an auction house, and that it has to be prepared for opening and closing, not sealed up, not taped up and everything, allows you to prepare a frame which is considerate of that. And hopefully, straightforward for text to, in being a sort of a technician at the same time as a framer, ready to go on the wall. So, with the strap hangers on the back being an accurate distance down from the top of the frame, just being ready to go in a way. But
considerate of that entire process, because you're knowledgeable of the entire process.
Well, you know the hassle that's required if you put a picture on the wall and it seems to be wonky. You think, I've checked this several times. My level is correct. It turns out that the hangers on the back are displaced by a centimetre. I mean, all these things can happen. But from there, it was I did a fair amount of work for the contemporary department, and being someone who was available and certainly enthusiastic, I was happy to do the work. And an absolutely fantastic place to showcase one's work in a very respectable environment. And certainly the galleries at Sotheby's and all auction houses, these are galleries designed to make things look as best as they possibly can be. And to see one's work as a framer protecting or displaying any number of works of art, a moment of immense pride. And this was certainly one of the early experiences which indicated that actually this proves the experiment that I might have had. Is it possible to take one's knowledge and apply it to tools and a space in which to create something? Can it be done? And just a moment of great satisfaction or gratification in being able to produce something which is then performs the ultimate function of any frame, and that is to make a work of art capable of being seen on the walls.
So on that, what has been your favorite artwork to frame so far? Because you have seen many.
Well, the frames I've made for the contemporary department, we happened upon a particular type of white frame that had museum glass, so UV filtering and anti-reflective.
A white frame, surprise.
Oh, well,
Sorry, that's me being a bit.
Well, no, but hey, it was a nice combination of materials.
Yeah.
White frame is almost the go-to presentation for contemporary work.
Yeah.
This is for the types of work that I was measuring up for, were mostly works on paper. And the two most prominent in my memory have been works of paper by Cy Twombly and Jean-Michel Basquiat. And they've both been really well. The Twombly was landscape orientation, a grey sort of chalkboard covering with chalk swirls, which this was one of the first major frames that I did for Sotheby's. I was very, very proud of that one. And then
how big was it?
This was the sheet was A1 size, so
okay, so not larger than life. It was
not like no. This but once you,
because that's probably exhausting.
Well, I mean, there are absolutely enormous works by Twombly.
Yeah, that's why I was like, oh.
Yeah. So this one was, I think the frame would probably been like a metre 10 across, maybe. Wow. So it does add. I mean, probably even more than maybe even a metre 20. I'm not sure. It does add some dimension to the work of art. And a similar style of frame was chosen for the Basquiat work on paper. But then the same amount of care would go into any frame.
Yeah. And
certainly if I am making for a frame for Sotheby's, I'm trying to do the very best thing I possibly can. It's the amazing amount of concern that will go into whether all sides of the frame, whereas no one's ever going to look at the underside of the bottom, or
I
no
know.
one's ever going to see the top. But it doesn't matter. It is all cared for.
I remember making the frame with you, Greg. I am fully aware. So this is my final question. How has your practice changed over the years? And is there anything that you would have done differently? Maybe in a way, if you could give a piece of advice to someone who may be interested in entering this part of the art sector.
Well, what I would say is that the education never stops. There's always something to learn. The conservation framing in itself probably only comes from the 1980s onwards, and this is America is normally leading the charge in the development of this technology. This is always improving year on year. At one point it would have been enough to just put glass in front of a work of art. Now one wouldn't even think about using anything less than a specialist glass to protect it. And the same goes for mount boards. I've seen works of art which are adhered to very rough bits of hardboard. Now you would really balk at anything which is less than conservation standard, which is a pH neutrality to it. Again, it's trying to game it in such a way that the artwork stands the best chance of survival. I've always thought there is a comparison to make between framing an artwork and, say, the ancient Egyptian attitude to enthroning or entombing a pharaoh in a sarcophagus.
Mummification.
You are preparing something for eternity. Well, obviously not eternity.
But how, as far as we can kind of imagine it, I guess, as much as we can do to influence that.
Yes, you're trying to remove the factors that would seek to destroy it, shall we say. But in terms of offering a perspective for someone who's interested in framing, it's one of those jobs which so much can be learned, or so much is learned on the job. And this is why I'd refer to my time at Steward Heslop's as an apprenticeship. It took me from a position of not knowing how to make a frame to one where in which I have had now experience of running a business and producing frames with my name on the back.
Gregory Baker Frames, everybody.
So experience is key, I think. I suppose the great aspect of working for a framers, and certainly as an arts graduate, is that it's an application of one's interest in one might be sympathetic to a number of the techniques used in picture framing, but it is a paying job. And as much as I might criticise my university for having a practically non-existent careers advice department, other than being a bit pie in the sky, that's another story. What I would say is that there is an industry out there of not just framing, but so many interconnected art handling professions that framing is again one of many, but a remarkable way to educate oneself not only about how to produce something, but about artwork itself. This is a time where at Steward Heslop, I'd never seen the back of a Frank Auerbach painting. Just things that as an art student, you get to see the things that you study. And they're not just things that are in a book, they're very real. And I suppose framing puts you in a position where you're able to enjoy the privilege of one-to-one physical contact with the thing that we're all interested in. And that remains the primary spark, I think. You have a hand in making something look, it's already great to look at, but you have a hand in maybe even improving just the manner in which one might encounter it in a gallery. So I think working for a framer is definitely certainly a brilliant way certainly the way in which I got into this. And through working for other framers, say at John Davies, this is around the corner from Christie's, it was my introduction to the auction house world. Then working at Sotheby's, this is my introduction to practical art handling. and then an application of the knowledge that I had acquired in different employers, to the point where you can see a position for yourself in this industry if only to apply your efforts. So I think I'd just hang about, really, just stick around and keep your mind open to the experience that art handling can offer.
Yeah. Stick about and keep learning.
Constant. I mean, at the moment, I've been working with a framer who's actually Dylan Shipton, who's a wonderful framer, brilliant framer. He and I were colleagues at Steward Heslop's. I've been doing a bit of work for him recently, and there are things that, knowledge that he has which are absolutely informative for things that I want to do.
Yeah.
And there's the potential for such great community and sharing of knowledge. It is a lifelong education. It doesn't stop. There are always ways to improve things. The craft and the discipline of constructing and making of frames, and the interaction one has with clients and institutions, galleries, it satisfies a huge aspect of what I find fundamentally interesting in the art world. And through making frames, it gives you a fairly unique perspective on not just the physical aspects of the artwork, but what efforts you can exert to contribute to its presentation. And that's just thoroughly satisfying.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me today and sharing all of this with me.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And that is it for today on All About Art. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a rating or a review, as it helps more people discover the show. Also, feel free to share with your friends, or if you share on social media, tag me and get in touch. Thank you so much for listening.
Oh, but before we sign off, there's one thing I'd like you to help me with.
Yeah.
You've got to open this.
While on the podcast? Okay.
This is great Foley sound recording.
I hope this isn't like a really important artwork, and then I just
Oh, it could be important.
Oh my goodness. Oh, Gregory Baker, fine art picture framing. Okay. Oh my God! You framed my Adrian Boswell.
I did.
Oh my God! Look at how loud I screamed. Oh my God! But I can't. Oh my God! Oh my God!
I did this earlier in the year.
Oh, Greg! Oh my God! Oops. Gregory Baker Frames at gmail.com. Get in touch if you need a bespoke frame. Oh my God! Ooh, this is a fancy one.
Well, so there's the options here. I didn't know whether you wanted it on a wire or whether you wanted to hang it on screws. So you've got the option
I've got
for both.
both.
Yeah. So snip the wire if you don't need it, or
Greg.
keep it on.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I did. This was basically an experiment to see. Okay, this is borrowed light, Farrow and Ball color. Can I make a blue frame? It was more hassle than I thought it was going to be. But I thought, right, I've got it to this stage. I have to complete it. I thought it was going to be a quick thing, but I thought, no, this is worth it. And I thought you'd appreciate
love it.
So.
Greg, thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh my God, the effort that goes into framing.
Well, this is a
huge gift.
No, this is Merry Christmas.
Oh, Greg.
Obviously.
Will you get chili cheese fries? Oh.
Now the trouble is, you've now got to add it to your satchel of.
That's okay. I'm only getting on the Victoria line. That's okay.
Okay.
Oh my God, I love it.
Well, put it on the.
I'm gonna stop recording now. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg.